Some people disappear, and we think it's because they don't care. But sometimes it's because they care more than they know how to handle. Avoidantly attached individuals aren't cold. They're overwhelmed by closeness. Saying goodbye would mean standing in front of another person's pain, witnessing their reaction, and possibly triggering emotions they've spent their whole life trying to avoid. To them, goodbye isn't just a polite gesture, it's a confrontation with everything they fear: vulnerability, emotion, intimacy. So instead of saying goodbye, they vanish. Not always because it's easier, but because for them, it feels safer. Distance is their defense mechanism. When someone with an avoidant attachment style senses the end of a relationship, they instinctively pull away. But here's the nuance. They don't always leave in anger or with malice. They leave in silence, sometimes with guilt, often with fear. Because to say goodbye means owning the impact they had on you, and they may not feel ready or capable of doing that. They fear saying the wrong thing. They fear being blamed. They fear being held emotionally accountable for pain they didn't intend to cause. They might even convince themselves that silence is the kinder option, that by not saying anything, they're sparing you the discomfort of a messy goodbye. But in truth, what they're sparing is themselves, from feeling the sadness, the tension, the emotional weight of ending something meaningful. Deep down, many avoidants associate emotional closeness with loss of control. So when things get intense, their instinct isn't to connect, it's to retreat. Disconnection feels safer than explanation. Silence is their version of self-protection. They often struggle with the idea that two things can be true. They cared about you and they wanted to leave. That they felt connection and suffocation at the same time. Saying goodbye would mean confronting those contradictions, and many avoidants simply don't know how to hold that emotional complexity. So instead, they disappear and tell themselves, it's better this way. It's not that they didn't want to explain, it's that explaining would mean unpacking feelings they've never been taught to process. And so they shut down. In their world, emotional distance equals emotional safety. If they were raised in an environment where emotional needs were minimized or ignored, they may have learned early on that the safest way to handle emotion is to avoid it altogether. So the idea of sitting down, opening up, and articulating why they're leaving, that's not just difficult, it's foreign. It feels like walking into a storm without any armor. That level of emotional exposure triggers a deep, unconscious fear that vulnerability will lead to pain, criticism, or rejection. The irony is that many avoidants don't even see themselves as avoidant. They see themselves as not dramatic, independent, or low maintenance. So when they pull away, they may rationalize it as not wanting to make things worse. But avoidance isn't the absence of emotion, it's the suppression of it. And that suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It leaks out, in ghosting, in passive withdrawal, in quiet exits that leave the other person confused and hurt. It's not that they didn't feel anything, it's that they didn't want to feel anything more. Because once an avoidant person senses emotional intensity, whether it's yours or theirs, they reach for control. And for them, control often looks like silence, distance, and detachment. They want to bypass the storm and get straight to the numbness. Saying goodbye would mean stepping into a moment they can't control. Your reaction, your sadness, your questions. That uncertainty terrifies them. So they choose the one thing they can control, their exit, quiet, sudden, and unexplained. This doesn't mean they don't feel guilt. In fact, some of them carry it for a long time. But guilt is easier to live with than fear for them. Saying goodbye opens a door they've spent years trying to keep closed. And so they walk away hoping that time will dissolve the emotions they're unwilling to face head on. They might even hope you'll forget, because then they won't have to remember. They won't have to explain. They won't have to face the emotional echo of what they left behind. When someone leaves quietly, without explanation, we often assume they don't care enough to say anything. But for avoidance, the truth is more complicated. Saying something would mean staying emotionally present in a situation that feels incredibly threatening. When the pressure builds, when feelings get intense, they freeze. They're not calculating, they're overwhelmed. And when they're overwhelmed, logic shuts down and self-preservation takes over. To them, disappearing isn't always a selfish act. It's an escape hatch from a room that suddenly feels too crowded with feeling. A proper goodbye would require them to slow down and engage emotionally. It would mean facing the fact that their words will land on someone else's heart, that what they say will carry weight, and weight is what they're trying to avoid. That moment of goodbye, of confrontation, becomes a mirror, one that reflects back not just the other person's hurt, but their own discomfort with accountability. Not because they're heartless, but because they've spent years building walls to avoid feeling out of control. And a goodbye in their mind is a place where they risk losing control. Many avoidants grew up equating closeness with chaos. If emotional connection in their early life meant conflict, criticism, or unpredictability, then even healthy intimacy later in life feels like a threat. So when a relationship begins to feel heavy or emotionally charged, their nervous system rings the alarm. And instead of leaning in, they pull away. Saying goodbye becomes a battlefield they don't want to step onto, not because they want to hurt the other person, but because they're terrified of being hurt themselves. They'd rather disappear than be vulnerable. They tell themselves stories to justify it. It's already over. What's the point? Or they'll be better off without this conversation. But those stories are shields, tools they use to numb the guilt, because somewhere deep down, they do know it's unfinished. They know someone on the other side of that silence is left spinning, questioning, aching for clarity. But admitting that would mean acknowledging the impact of their actions. And for someone who fears emotional entanglement, that kind of admission feels unbearable. To say goodbye is to stand still in discomfort. It requires emotional maturity, something avoidants might not have been taught or encouraged to develop. So instead, they bolt. Not with a plan, not always with awareness, just instinct. Silence becomes their way of managing the moment, or more accurately, dodging the moment. The irony is that what feels like protection to them often feels like betrayal to the person left behind. But they're so consumed with escaping discomfort that they don't always see the damage in real time. There's also an unconscious belief that if they say nothing, it'll all just fade away. That time will dull the intensity. That eventually, the person they left will move on and they won't have to face any messy feelings. But what they underestimate is the emotional residue silence leaves behind. The unanswered questions, the emotional cliffhanger, the lingering confusion, it all builds into something that doesn't just disappear. And even if they avoid it in the moment, it follows them into future relationships, into their view of themselves, into the way they handle every ending thereafter. Avoidants aren't trying to be cruel. In fact, many of them genuinely hate the idea of causing pain. That's why they convince themselves that disappearing is a softer alternative. But disappearing doesn't prevent pain. It just defers it. It moves it from their side of the street to yours. It says, I can't deal with this, so you'll have to. They shut the door quietly, hoping no one will knock on it again. Not because you didn't matter, but because the feeling of you mattered too much, and they didn't have the tools to sit with it. What they don't realize is that leaving without words doesn't delete the connection. It just cuts it in a way that's jagged and unresolved. And as much as they may try to run from those final moments, they often replay them too. But they do it silently, alone, and with shame they don't know how to express. Because somewhere inside, they know the easier route wasn't the honest one. But at the time, honesty felt impossible. Not because it wasn't available, but because emotional exposure has never felt safe enough to choose. Anxiously attached, people don't just want clarity, they need it to feel safe. Certainty gives their nervous system something to rest on, something solid. When someone leaves without saying anything, it's not just confusing, it's destabilizing. Their mind doesn't interpret silence as neutral. It interprets it as danger. Silence is filled with meaning. It's loud. It tells a story. And unfortunately, anxious people often write themselves as the villain in that story. The anxious mind is constantly scanning for signs. Was it the tone of that last message? Did they misread the mood? Did they say too much, ask for too much, feel too deeply? Without words to anchor them, they spiral into overthinking. They don't just wonder what went wrong, they dissect it minute by minute. moment by moment. Silence becomes an open loop, and anxious people can't tolerate open loops. They need emotional closure to feel like the floor isn't about to fall out from under them. For an anxiously attached person, a breakup isn't just a loss, it's a rupture. One that reactivates every old wound that tells them love is unpredictable and people always leave. When the ending comes with no explanation, that wound doesn't just get triggered, it gets amplified. Their fear isn't just that you're gone, it's that you're gone without caring enough to explain. And that confirms one of their deepest insecurities, that they are too much, or worse, not enough, that they were easy to walk away from. Without clarity, they fill the gaps with assumptions. Painful, self-blaming, often irrational assumptions. And once those thoughts take root, it's incredibly hard to pull them out. Because for the anxious person, closure isn't just about moving on. It's about regaining a sense of emotional safety. It's about knowing the ending wasn't their fault. But when no one tells them otherwise, they assume it was. They carry the weight of the silence and turn it into a personal indictment. They replay old conversations looking for clues. They reread texts, remember facial expressions, and second-guess everything they said and did. Not because they're obsessed, but because they're desperately trying to make sense of chaos. Anxious attachment is about craving predictability, and nothing is more unpredictable than someone going quiet without warning. It's not just a breakup, it's an emotional cliffhanger with no final page. That kind of uncertainty is a storm they can't stop reliving. They might even reach out for answers, hoping that just one response will give them peace. But when those messages go unanswered, it deepens the wound. Now, it's not just about being left, it's about being ignored, erased, invalidated. And that pain isn't logical, it's primal. The anxious system interprets that silence as abandonment, as rejection of their very need to be seen and heard. And without validation, they begin to lose trust, not just in others, but in their own emotional instincts. The worst part is they often blame themselves for needing closure in the first place. They feel weak for caring, ashamed for reaching out, embarrassed for overthinking, but they can't turn it off. Because their attachment system isn't wired to detach easily. It's wired to hold on until it feels safe enough to let go. And when someone leaves in silence, that safety never comes. So they keep clinging to the hope that one day it will, that an answer will arrive, that the story will make sense. But as time passes and silence stretches, the anxious person doesn't get peace, they get exhaustion. Not just from the overthinking, but from carrying the emotional weight alone. Because without words to close the chapter, the story keeps writing itself inside their mind. They imagine what they did wrong, how they could have fixed it, what they should have seen coming. The ending is ambiguous, and for an anxious person, ambiguity isn't neutral. It's a breeding ground for self-doubt that never stops growing. When a relationship ends with silence, it doesn't actually end for the anxious person, it lingers. The absence of explanation leaves space their mind has to fill. And it doesn't fill it with kindness. It fills it with questions, regrets, and harsh self-analysis. They try to make meaning from the void, but because there's no confirmation or context, their brain starts pulling from the past. Every flaw, every mistake, every fear. Instead of being released from the relationship, they become more entangled in it. They don't just wonder what went wrong, they assume it's their fault, that they asked for too much, that they were too emotional, that they pushed the other person away by caring too deeply. It becomes a narrative they replay constantly. I ruined it. The silence doesn't say, this just wasn't right. It says, you weren't worth a goodbye. That thought doesn't just hurt, it rewires how they see themselves. And the longer the silence lasts, the deeper that belief sets in. Rumination becomes a coping strategy. They go back in time, replay conversations, search for signs they missed. They build theories, obsess over possibilities, script fake conversations in their head, trying to resolve what never got resolved. They imagine what they would have said, what they should have said, what they'll still say if given the chance. But the person they're imagining that with is already gone and probably not coming back. Still, their mind keeps working the problem like it's solvable. This is the emotional loop that silence creates. one where the anxious person becomes the detective, the judge, the jury, and the one on trial. They hold themselves accountable for someone else's withdrawal. They think, if I could just figure this out, I'll finally be able to let go. But closure doesn't come from figuring it out. It comes from acceptance. And that's exactly what the anxious attachment system resists, because acceptance feels like giving up on understanding, and understanding feels like safety. So instead of letting go, they stay mentally stuck in a relationship that no longer exists. Not because they're desperate, but because their nervous system doesn't feel finished. Because the connection ended externally, but internally, it's still playing out. And that disconnect creates suffering. It's like having a song stuck in your head that never reaches the final note. And when you never hear the end, you keep replaying it, hoping to finally feel the release that never comes. Even when they try to move on, the past creeps in, not as nostalgia, but as confusion. A random trigger, a song, a place, a phrase, sends them back into the same questions. Why didn't they say anything? Was I really that easy to leave? Did I mean anything to them at all? And when no new answers come, the brain pulls from the same tired conclusions. I must not have been enough. It becomes an emotional echo chamber, one where they're both the speaker and the only person listening. They start doubting their worth in future relationships. They hesitate to be vulnerable again, not because they don't want connection, but because they associate closeness with unpredictability and pain. They internalize the idea that being left without a word is somehow what they deserve, that their needs for communication, clarity, and reassurance are just too much. And when those needs come up again, they'll be more likely to suppress them, because next time they'll try not to be a burden. This is how lack of closure doesn't just hurt, it reshapes. It changes how the anxious person shows up in every relationship after, not with openness, but with caution, not with confidence, but with fear of repeating the same silent ending. And yet the irony is they still hope quietly, sometimes even years later, that the person who disappeared will one day give them the closure they never got. Not even to rekindle things, but just to feel like their pain was seen by the person who caused it. To the avoidant, saying nothing often feels easier than saying the wrong thing. They don't think of their silence as cruelty. They see it as control, a way to avoid emotional escalation, conflict, or uncomfortable truths. In their mind, silence can be spun into mercy. If I just go quietly, they won't have to hear something painful. They convince themselves they're protecting the other person, when really they're protecting themselves. They don't want to be in the moment where their words land like a cut. Avoidants fear being the bad guy, so rather than saying something honest that might cause emotion or confrontation, they vanish and tell themselves it was for the best. But avoidance doesn't remove the pain, it only delays it and shifts the burden onto the other person. The goodbye still happens, it just happens in the other person's head. And now, instead of hearing a few painful truths, that person hears nothing and fills in the blanks with their worst fears. Silence becomes a wound that's harder to name and therefore harder to heal. To the avoidant, expressing emotion often feels unsafe. They grew up believing that feelings complicate things, that vulnerability makes them weak or unstable. So when a breakup looms, their instinct isn't to talk, it's to flee. And they tell themselves the story that saying goodbye would just drag it out. But what they're really avoiding is the mirror that a goodbye holds up to them. A goodbye says, "This mattered." It forces them to acknowledge the depth of something they spent the whole relationship trying not to feel too much. So instead, they exit on their own terms, quietly, without mess, without a trace. But beneath that calm exterior is often panic, because if they really let themselves feel what the ending means, it would overwhelm them. Emotional finality requires emotional presence, something they've spent years running from. So they go into stealth mode, make a clean break, and pretend that silence equals strength, that avoiding hard conversations means avoiding drama. But inside, it's not peace they feel, it's distance. They use logic to justify it. They'll get over it. It wasn't serious anyway. No point in dragging this out. and maybe some of those things are even partially true. But the real truth is often underneath. They were afraid. Afraid of the intensity, afraid of their own discomfort, afraid of the consequences of real honesty. Saying goodbye feels like giving someone a piece of themselves they're not ready to hand over, so they stay in control by giving nothing. Not words, not closure, not even acknowledgement. They believe that disappearing saves them both from awkwardness. But that story conveniently erases the other person's need for clarity. For the avoidant, the story ends when they decide to leave. But for the other person, the story starts with that silence. And that disconnect is what avoidants often don't realize. Their silence is not a neutral act. It leaves an emotional fingerprint. And pretending it was kinder to disappear doesn't erase the confusion, the heartbreak, or the sense of being abandoned without dignity. They may even look back later and feel guilt, but avoidants tend to process emotion after the fact in silence, just like they leave. And because they never learned how to have those hard conversations, they don't know how to go back and clean up what they left behind. So instead of facing it, they double down. They stay quiet. They convince themselves that reopening the door would do more harm than good. But what they're really doing is avoiding the discomfort of accountability, a skill they never got the chance to develop. To say goodbye would require them to step outside the persona they've built, the independent, unfazed, always in control version of themselves. It would mean dropping the mask and showing up emotionally, maybe even awkwardly, but honestly. And that's the very thing they've been trained not to do. So when the moment comes to say something real, they retreat into silence and tell themselves it was noble. But that silence isn't selfless. It's safe. Safe for them, not for the person they left behind. Avoidance and anxious types are often drawn to each other, but they speak two different emotional languages. One seeks closeness to soothe fear, the other creates distance to avoid it. This dynamic creates a cycle where the anxious person keeps reaching out, hoping to feel safer, while the avoidant pulls back, feeling suffocated. It's not because either person is cruel, it's because their emotional survival instincts are completely opposed. What calms one person triggers the other. What feels like love to one feels like pressure to the other. When things start to get emotionally intense, the avoidance instinct is to shut down. They retreat, disconnect, detach, not because they don't care, but because they feel overwhelmed. The anxious person, sensing that shift, instinctively leans in. They seek reassurance, clarity, connection. But the more they reach, the more the avoidant pulls away. It becomes a painful dance, one person chasing, the other escaping, and no one ever gets what they need, because neither one is emotionally equipped to bridge the gap in that moment. For the anxious person, distance feels like abandonment. It activates panic, rumination, fear of being forgotten, so they try harder. They text again. They over-explain. They replay conversations, hoping to find the one sentence that will bring the avoidant back. But the avoidant sees all of this not as love, but as pressure. They feel trapped, emotionally cornered, and their nervous system screams for space. The more they disconnect, the more they convince themselves that leaving is the only way to survive. Avoidants equate emotional needs with chaos. They often grew up feeling that closeness led to drama, so they learned to keep people at arm's length. Anxious people, on the other hand, often grew up with unpredictability too, but they learned to cling tighter when things felt unsafe. So when an avoidant disappears, the anxious person experiences it not just as rejection, but as confirmation that love is always conditional. And because neither person understands the other's emotional blueprint, both end up feeling hurt and unseen. This is how two people can both be in pain, but express it in ways that push each other further apart. The avoidant thinks, I can't breathe, I need space. The anxious partner thinks, I'm drowning, I need connection. They don't realize they're reacting to the same fear, just in opposite directions. One is trying to control the chaos by disappearing. The other is trying to control it by getting closer. But neither one feels in control. Both are just trying to feel safe, using the tools they learned long before this relationship. The avoidant believes space will bring relief, and for a while, it does. But the guilt eventually creeps in. The memory of the person they left behind, the unresolved tension, the loose ends they never tied. The anxious person, meanwhile, believes that clarity will bring peace. But in the absence of answers, they turn that need for clarity inward, and it becomes self-blame. Each person suffers in isolation, not because they're broken, but because their needs were never understood, never voiced, never honored by the other. This dynamic doesn't just create pain in the breakup, it shapes how both people walk away. The avoidant walks away physically, but often with unfinished emotion tucked deep inside. The anxious person stays emotionally, even when the other is long gone, hoping one day they'll get the explanation that sets them free. But when one person avoids emotional weight and the other carries all of it, the aftermath isn't fair. It leaves the anxious person holding a grief that never had a proper beginning, middle, or end. What makes this cycle so damaging is that neither side is inherently wrong. They're just operating from different emotional blueprints. But without awareness, the pattern repeats. The avoidant disappears again in their next connection, and the anxious person finds themselves stuck, yet again, chasing closure from someone who doesn't know how to give it. And what started as one relationship becomes a pattern they carry, over and over, until someone finally understands the mismatch, names it, and starts learning a new way to respond.